The first thing I noticed wasn't another man's name. It wasn't a late-night text. It wasn't perfume that wasn't hers, or lipstick on a collar, or any of the things people warn you about in movies and sad country songs. It was a lock screen. My wife, Dana, had never locked her phone in 11 years of marriage. Not once. She'd hand it to me to read directions while she drove. She'd leave it face up on the kitchen counter while she showered. Her passcode, back when she had one, was our wedding anniversary. She told me that herself, laughing, the first year we were married, said she had nothing to hide. So when I reached over one Saturday morning to silence an alert on her phone, because she was in the shower and it kept buzzing, and the screen asked me for a 6-digit code I didn't know, I felt something shift in my chest. Not rage, not suspicion, not yet. Just a quiet, cold recognition that something had changed. I set the phone back down. I didn't say anything when she came out. I handed her a coffee, kissed her on the cheek, and watched her pick up that phone and type in a code without thinking, the way you do when a habit has already fully formed. Which meant this wasn't new. That was the part that stayed with me through breakfast, through our conversation about groceries and the neighbor's dog, and whether we needed to repaint the back fence. The code wasn't new. She'd been doing this long enough that her fingers didn't hesitate. I smiled at the right times. I nodded. I refilled her coffee. And I started paying attention in a way I hadn't in years. Now, if you're expecting this to be a story about me going through her phone, it isn't. I never did. Not because I didn't want to, but because I figured out early on that the phone was a distraction. Whatever was on it, whatever she was protecting, that was just a symptom. What I needed to understand was the pattern. So I started tracking something else entirely. Something she didn't think to hide, because she didn't think I was watching that closely. She was wrong. And by the time I finished what I was tracking, I didn't need her phone at all. I had something far more valuable than a text thread or a deleted photo. I had a complete picture. Documented, dated, undeniable. This is the story of how my wife's locked phone became the least important secret she was keeping, and how the thing I tracked instead ended an 11-year marriage and changed everything I thought I knew about the woman I'd built my life with. Stay with me, because this doesn't go where you think it's going. 3:56 p.m. Dana and I met when we were both 26. She was working at a marketing firm downtown. I was 3 years into a project management job that paid decently but didn't excite me yet. We met at a mutual friend's birthday dinner, sat across from each other, and talked until the restaurant started stacking chairs around us. She was sharp, funny in a dry, unexpected way. She asked questions that actually required you to think before answering. I was used to first conversations that stayed on the surface. Dana didn't do surface. We dated for 2 years before I proposed. Married at 29. Bought a house at 31 in a suburb that felt like the right next step. The kind of neighborhood where people mow their lawns on Saturday mornings and wave at each other from driveways. From the outside, we looked like the plan working. And for a while, it genuinely was. The early years were good. Not perfect, no marriages, but solid. We had arguments about money and time and whose turn it was to handle the thing neither of us wanted to handle. Normal friction, the kind that comes from two people building something together and occasionally disagreeing about how the walls should go up. What we didn't have, back then, was distance.
I worked long hours and she climbed steadily at her firm, eventually making senior account manager by the time she was 34. I was proud of her. I told her that. We celebrated with a dinner at a restaurant we couldn't quite afford yet and split a bottle of wine that tasted like we'd earned it. Looking back, I think that was close to the peak. Not the dinner, not the promotion, but the version of us where the effort still felt mutual, where we were both still rowing in the same direction without keeping score. I want to be clear about something before this story moves forward. I wasn't a perfect husband. I got absorbed in work stretches that lasted too long. There were weekends I was physically present and mentally somewhere else. I didn't always ask the right questions or notice the right things. But I was faithful, I was honest, and I was trying. I say that not to position myself as a saint, but because it matters for what comes later. Because when someone uses your imperfections as a reason to justify what they're doing behind your back, you need to have already asked yourself the hard question honestly. I asked it. more than once. The answer was always the same. What I gave this marriage wasn't the problem. What was happening in the dark, without my knowledge, without my consent, that was the problem. And it had been building for longer than I knew. The first red flag I explained away was the gym. Dana had never been a gym person. In 11 years, she'd gone through maybe 3 short phases of working out, a few weeks of enthusiasm, then nothing. It was a running joke between us. She'd buy the gear, download the app, go 4 times, and quietly stop. I teased her about it gently. She'd laugh and admit it freely. So when she joined a new gym in March and started going 5 mornings a week without missing a single session, I noticed. But I told myself it was a good thing. People change. People commit to new habits.
I didn't want to be the husband who treated his wife's self-improvement like a suspicious act, so I said nothing. I was supportive. I told her she looked great. She did look great. That was the part that quietly worked on me in the background. The second flag was the phone calls she took outside. Not every call, just certain ones. She'd be sitting in the living room and her phone would ring, and she'd glance at the screen and then stand up and walk to the backyard or into the bedroom and close the door. Calm about it. No rush, no visible anxiety, just a smooth, practiced exit. When I asked once, casually, who'd called, she said it was a work client who was difficult and she didn't want the background noise of the TV distracting her. Reasonable. I accepted it. But I noticed she did it again the following week, and the week after that. The third flag was the way she started talking about our marriage in the past tense. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have alarmed anyone listening from outside, but I was inside the conversation, and I caught it. Small phrases. We used to do that. That was a good time back then. I remember when we were like that. We were still married. We were still in the same house. There was no back then yet. But in her language, apparently, there already was. I want to be honest about what I did with all of this at the time. I filed it. I didn't confront. I didn't accuse. Partly because I had no proof of anything, and partly because I think I was still hoping there was a version of this that had a simple explanation. The gym was just the gym. The calls were just work. The past tense language was just the way long marriages talk sometimes. I wanted the simple explanation to be true, but the flags kept coming. She started being vague about her schedule in a way she never had been before. Not secretive exactly, just imprecise. I'll be back later. I've got some things to take care of. It might run long. These were not the answers of a woman who used to text me what she wanted for dinner before she'd even left the office. The emotional withdrawal was the one that hit hardest, though. Not a sudden cold shoulder, nothing that obvious. It was more like a slow dimming. The conversations got shorter. The physical affection became procedural, a goodnight kiss that felt like a checkbox. She stopped asking about my day with any real curiosity. I was becoming furniture in my own house. And what makes that particular kind of loneliness so hard to name is that nothing is technically wrong. She hadn't done anything I could point to. She was still there, still functioning as a wife in the surface-level ways, still present at dinner, still sleeping in the same bed. But she had already started to leave. I just didn't have proof of where she was going yet. The dinner was Marcus's idea. Marcus was one of those mutual friends who existed in both our social circles. Dana knew him first. I'd grown to like him over the years. He hosted these semi-regular dinners at his house. Nice evenings. Good food, comfortable conversation, the kind of group where everyone had known each other long enough that nobody was performing anymore. I'd always enjoyed them. So had Dana, or so I thought. This particular dinner was a Saturday in late April. 6 of us around the table. Marcus and his girlfriend, another couple we'd known for years, Dana and me. Wine opened early, the conversation easy at the start. That's when I first noticed him paying attention to Dana in a way that had texture to it. His name was Reed. He was Marcus's coworker, a late addition to the evening. Mid-30s, confident in the relaxed way of someone who's been told he's charming enough times that it's become his default setting. He sat 2 seats down from Dana, and within 20 minutes they were deep in a side conversation that had its own rhythm, its own inside references, its own shorthand.
Not the shorthand of people who just met. I watched that for a moment.
Then I picked up my wine and rejoined the main conversation, and told myself I was reading into it. Then Dana laughed at something Reed said, a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere unguarded, and I realized I hadn't heard that laugh in months. That landed somewhere uncomfortable. I let it sit. The moment that changed the evening came about an hour in. I was making a point about something work-related, a project I'd been leading that had hit a difficult stretch. It wasn't a complaint, just context for a story, the kind of thing you share at a dinner table among people you trust. Dana cut me off. Not aggressively, smoothly, the way you change a channel. She said, "He always does this," with a small smile directed at the table. Light tone, meant to land as affectionate teasing. It didn't land that way, because what followed was a 30-second summary of what she apparently considered my habit of over-explaining work problems that weren't that interesting. She said it with a laugh. Reed smiled. A couple of people at the table gave the polite, slightly uncomfortable chuckle of people who aren't sure if they just witnessed a joke or something else. I didn't react. I smiled and let the conversation move. But I felt it. The specific sting of being reduced in front of people you respect by the one person who was supposed to be on your side at that table. It wasn't what she said. It was the audience she chose to say it to, and the ease with which she said it, and the way her eyes moved to Reed immediately after, as if checking whether it landed the way she intended. It had landed. He smiled at her in a way I recognized. That was the moment I stopped explaining things away. Later in the evening, Dana touched Reed's arm twice during conversation. Small contact, brief, the kind a person does without thinking when they're comfortable with someone. She hadn't touched me once all night.
We drove home mostly in silence. She said the dinner was fun. I agreed. I didn't bring up what I'd seen because I needed to think before I spoke. By the time I pulled into our driveway, I had already made a decision. I was going to start paying very close attention. Here's what I didn't do. I didn't go through her purse. I didn't hire someone. I didn't install anything on her devices or check her location without her knowledge. I want to be clear about that, because it matters, not just legally, but personally. The moment I crossed into that territory, I would have become someone I didn't recognize, and whatever I found, it would have been tainted by how I found it. So I did something quieter, something she never saw coming, because it looked like nothing from the outside. I started a document, a plain private notes file on my personal laptop, password protected, backed up somewhere she had no access to. And every day, sometimes twice a day, I added entries. Not feelings, not venting. Data. Dates, times, observations. Specific things said and done, and notably not done. I logged the outdoor phone calls with approximate durations. I logged the gym schedule and cross-referenced it against the 2 times she'd mentioned being tired from a workout, because the days she said that never matched the day she'd actually gone. I logged the expenses I could see on our joint account, small things at first. A restaurant I didn't recognize, a charge at a boutique she'd never mentioned visiting. I logged the emotional temperature of our evenings, not poetically, clinically. Tuesday, minimal conversation at dinner, no physical contact. In bed by 9, phone face down on her nightstand, screen on twice between 10 and midnight. I wasn't doing this out of obsession. I was doing it because I'd learned something important about my own psychology over those weeks. My memory was unreliable when I was emotionally involved. I would second-guess myself.
I would soften things in retrospect. I would talk myself out of what I'd clearly seen. The document didn't do that. The document just held what happened. Within 3 weeks, a pattern emerged that I couldn't rationalize away. The gym visits clustered on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, but the charges on our joint card from the gym's app only showed Monday and Wednesday check-ins. She was going somewhere on Tuesdays and Thursdays that wasn't the gym. The restaurant charge I didn't recognize appeared 3 times in 6 weeks. Same place, lunch hours, on days she told me she was eating at her desk. And there was a name that had started appearing in our household in small ways. Not dramatically, just Reed, mentioned in passing. Reed said something funny at Marcus's thing. Apparently Reed just got back from a work trip. Dropped into conversation the way you drop in a name when you're trying to normalize it, when you're trying to make someone feel like they already know this person well enough that the name shouldn't raise questions.
She was preemptively making him familiar. I added all of it to the document without comment, without confrontation. I kept my behavior at home exactly the same as it had been. Same routines, same conversations, same level of engagement. Because the moment she knew I was watching, the behavior would change, and I needed the behavior to keep revealing itself naturally. What I had after 3 weeks wasn't proof of an affair, not technically, not yet, but what I had was a clear, documented record of a woman whose stated life and actual life had stopped matching up, and that gap was getting wider. The financial discrepancies were what sharpened everything. I want to be honest. Up until this point, I had been operating on pattern recognition and instinct. The document was disciplined, but what it contained was still circumstantial. Unexplained gym visits in a restaurant I didn't know aren't evidence of anything on their own.
People have private lunches. People change routines. I knew that. I kept reminding myself of that. But then I started looking more carefully at our finances, and the picture changed. We had 2 accounts, a joint checking account for household expenses and individual accounts we'd each maintained since before we were married. That arrangement had always worked fine. We were transparent about the joint account and respectfully private about our individual ones. No prenuptial agreement, but an understanding. It had never been a source of conflict. What I could see on the joint account was already telling a story. Over the previous 4 months, Dana's contributions to our shared expenses had become irregular. She earned a strong salary. The math didn't require her to be inconsistent. But twice in 4 months, she'd been 2 weeks late moving her portion in, and once she'd moved in less than her usual amount without mentioning it. Small things, possibly nothing, but I noted them. Then I found the receipt. It was in the pocket of a jacket she'd asked me to drop at the dry cleaner. I wasn't going through her things. I was doing what she'd asked, transferring the jacket from the hook by the door into a bag. The receipt fell out when I picked it up. A hotel, 40 minutes outside the city. A Tuesday in March. A single night. Checked in at 4 in the afternoon. Checked out the following morning. I stood in the hallway for a long time holding that piece of paper. In March, I had been away for a 3-day work conference. I remembered it clearly because Dana had said she was going to use the time to visit her sister. I had texted her from the conference hotel on that Tuesday evening. She'd responded within a few minutes, told me she was having dinner with her sister, that everything was fine, that she missed me. She had not been at her sister's.
I photographed the receipt with my phone, put it back in the jacket pocket exactly as I'd found it, and dropped the jacket at the dry cleaner as she'd asked. Then I came home and opened my document. I added the receipt details, the date, the location, the cross-reference to my conference, and the text exchange we'd had that evening. I noted the exact wording she'd used. I noted the timestamp. Then I sat back and let myself feel what I was feeling for exactly 10 minutes. Because I knew that after those 10 minutes, I needed to be clear-headed. I needed to think about what I actually knew versus what I was assuming. I needed to be precise. What I knew was this. My wife had spent a night at a hotel 40 minutes from our home on a night she told me she was somewhere else entirely. What I didn't yet know was who she'd been with. But a name was already sitting in the back of my mind. It had been sitting there since a Saturday dinner in April, when a man named Reed smiled at my wife in a way that told me he already knew her well. The document now had enough in it that I could no longer call what I was holding circumstantial. I was holding the outline of a betrayal. I just needed one more piece before I decided what to do with it. I wasn't supposed to be home that Thursday. My afternoon meeting had been canceled last minute, a scheduling conflict on the client's end, rescheduled for the following week. It was just after 2 in the afternoon. I was already in my car in the office parking lot when I got the notification. I sat there for a moment, thought about going back inside, then decided to just head home. No particular reason. I wasn't suspicious of that specific afternoon. I wasn't following a lead or acting on instinct. It was just a canceled meeting and a Tuesday that had become unexpectedly free. I pulled into our street and noticed Dana's car in the driveway. That alone wasn't alarming. She worked from home 2 days a week. But as I got closer, I noticed a second car parked just past our driveway, partially on the street. A gray sedan I didn't recognize as a neighbor's. I parked down the block. I don't know exactly why. Something made me slow down before pulling in. I sat in my car for a few minutes. Then I got out, walked to the front door, and put my key in the lock as quietly as I could manage, which felt strange even as I was doing it. It was my house.
I lived there. I had every right to walk through that door at 2 in the afternoon. I opened the door. The house wasn't silent. There were voices coming from the kitchen. 2 of them. Dana's and a man's. Talking in the low, comfortable register of people who were relaxed, not rushed, not guilty sounding, which somehow made it worse. They weren't scrambling. They were settled. I stood in the entryway, and I listened. What I heard wasn't explicit. There was no confession, no declaration. What I heard was the texture of 2 people who were deeply familiar with each other in a way that had nothing to do with being coworkers or casual friends. The shorthand, the easy silence between sentences, the way she laughed at something he said before he'd even finished saying it. Then I heard her say his name, Reed. And then I heard her say something that I have thought about nearly every day since. She said, "He doesn't really see me anymore. He hasn't for a long time. I think he's just comfortable." There was a pause. Then Reed said quietly, "You deserve more than comfortable." I stood in my entryway, and I did not move for a long time. I want to tell you I felt rage. That would be a cleaner emotion to describe. But what I actually felt was something closer to grief. A sudden, total understanding that what I had been refusing to fully believe for months was simply true. It had been true for a while, long enough that she had a narrative about it, long enough that she'd rehearsed the explanation for why it was justified. He doesn't see her.
He's just comfortable. She deserves more. I had been rewritten as the obstacle in my own marriage. I stepped back outside. I closed the door without a sound. I walked back to my car, and I sat there until I heard the front door open, heard the brief exchange of voices at the threshold, heard a car start and pull away. Then I waited another 10 minutes. Then I went inside. Dana was in the kitchen making coffee. She looked up when I came in and said she hadn't heard me come home. I told her my meeting had been canceled. She said that was nice, that she'd have a cup ready for me in a minute. I sat down at the kitchen table and said that would be great. And I didn't say another word about what I had just heard, because I wasn't ready to end it yet. I needed to be fully prepared before I walked into that conversation. I needed every piece in place. But I knew now, completely, without any remaining doubt. And she had no idea that I did. I called a lawyer on a Friday morning while Dana was at the gym. The real gym, this time. I'd stopped tracking which days were real and which weren't. It no longer mattered. What mattered now was moving carefully and quickly in the right direction. The lawyer's name was Patricia. She came recommended by a colleague who'd been through a difficult divorce 2 years prior and had navigated it with his finances and dignity mostly intact. That was what I needed. Not aggression. Not someone who would turn this into a war. Someone precise. I laid out the situation in broad terms without becoming emotional about it. 11 years of marriage, no children, joint property, the house primarily, individual accounts, a joint account. My wife, who had been conducting what appeared to be an ongoing affair, with documented behavioral evidence and a hotel receipt that contradicted a specific alibi she'd given me. Patricia listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked 3 questions. Whether Dana's name was on the mortgage equally.
Whether we had any shared business interests. Whether I had the documentation I'd mentioned in a format that was retrievable and organized. Yes, no, yes. She told me what my options looked like in practical terms. She explained what a separation agreement would involve versus full divorce proceedings. She outlined what the asset division would likely look like given our situation. She was calm and specific and didn't editorialize. I appreciated that. I didn't need someone to tell me I deserved better. I needed someone to tell me what came next. Before I left that first meeting, Patricia gave me 2 pieces of advice I followed precisely. The first was to open an individual checking account at a bank separate from any institution Dana and I currently used, and to begin redirecting a portion of my income there. Not concealment, just protection. Establishing a financial foothold that was clearly mine before any proceedings began. The second was to stop adding to the joint account beyond my existing obligations until we had further clarity. Not as a punitive measure, as a practical one. I did both things within the week. I also quietly made copies of every shared financial document I had access to. Tax returns from the past 4 years, mortgage statements, the joint account history going back 18 months. I organized everything and stored it outside the house. I want to be honest about what this phase felt like from the inside. It didn't feel powerful. It didn't feel like a plan coming together or a victory being engineered. It felt like grief with a checklist, like I was simultaneously mourning something and being forced to act professionally about it because no one was going to protect my interests if I didn't. I went home every evening that week and had dinner with my wife. We talked about ordinary things. She told me about a project at work. I told her about the rescheduled client meeting. We watched television for an hour and went to bed.
She had no idea what I'd set in motion, and I had stopped feeling guilty about that, because she had made her choices quietly, without my knowledge, without my consent. She had protected her interests for months while I was still trying to figure out what was happening. I was simply doing the same, not out of revenge, out of necessity. The conversation was coming. I just needed to be standing on solid ground when it arrived. I chose a Sunday evening. No particular symbolism to it. It was just a time when neither of us had anywhere to be the next morning, when the house was quiet, when there was no reasonable excuse for either of us to leave the conversation before it was finished. Dana was on the couch reading when I came and sat down across from her, not next to her, across. She looked up, registered something in my expression, and put her book down without me asking her to. I placed my laptop on the coffee table between us, open to the document. I didn't raise my voice. I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters. There was no shouting, no broken dishes, no moment where I lost control of myself. I had rehearsed this conversation in my head enough times that the emotion had been worn smooth. What was left was just the truth, stated plainly. I told her I knew about Reed. I told her I knew about the hotel in March. I told her I had been documenting the pattern of behavior for 2 months, and that what I had compiled told a clear and consistent story. I told her I had already spoken to a lawyer. She didn't deny it. That was the part I hadn't fully prepared for. Not because I expected denial, but because I think somewhere underneath all of it, I had still been holding a small, irrational hope that there would be an explanation, that she would say something that reframed everything in a way I hadn't considered. She didn't. She sat very still for a moment, and then she said she was sorry. Not in a collapsed, desperate way.
In the measured tone of someone who had already imagined this conversation and had their version of it ready. Then she said the thing I had heard her say to Reed in our kitchen, that she hadn't felt seen in a long time, that she knew it wasn't the right way to handle it, that things had been wrong between us for longer than I realized, and she hadn't known how to say it. I let her finish. Then I told her that I understood she was unhappy, that unhappiness in a marriage was real and worth addressing, but that the correct response to feeling unseen was a conversation with your husband, or a therapist, or in the worst case, a separation, not a hotel 40 minutes from our home, while I was texting her from a conference thinking she was with her sister. She didn't have an answer for that. The silence that followed was long. Not uncomfortable exactly, just final. The kind of silence that exists when everything that needed to be said has been said, and both people know it. I told her I thought we both knew this marriage was over, that I wasn't interested in counseling as a way to delay the inevitable, and that I hoped we could handle what came next with the same lack of drama as this conversation. She asked me if I hated her. I told her honestly that I didn't, that I was profoundly hurt, and that I had lost my trust in her completely, but that hatred required an ongoing investment of energy I wasn't willing to make. She nodded slowly. Her eyes were wet, but she didn't cry. I closed the laptop and told her I'd be sleeping in the guest room, and that we should plan to talk to our respective lawyers by the end of the week. Then I stood up and walked down the hall. Behind me, the house was completely quiet. The divorce took 7 months. Not contentious, as these things go. Dana didn't fight the process. I think on some level she understood that I had been more prepared than she expected, and that the documentation I had quietly built made certain conversations unnecessary.
There was no dispute about what had happened. There was only the practical work of separating 2 lives that had been woven together for 11 years. We sold the house, split the equity evenly. I found an apartment on the other side of the city, smaller than I expected to be living in at 40, but clean and quiet and entirely mine. I won't pretend the months after were easy. There's a specific kind of loneliness that comes after a long marriage ends. Not the loneliness of being alone. I could handle that. It was the loneliness of shared context, the absence of someone who knew your references, your history, your shorthand. Even when the marriage had been failing, even when I'd been sleeping in the guest room and communicating through lawyers, there had still been someone in the house who knew who I was. Then there wasn't. That took longer to adjust to than I expected. But I want to be honest about what I learned on the other side of it, because I think that's the only reason a story like this is worth telling. The locked phone was never the point. I know that now more clearly than ever. The phone was just the moment my attention finally sharpened. What it pointed me toward was something I should have been paying attention to long before, not to catch her, but to understand what was actually happening in my own life. I had been comfortable. She wasn't wrong about that. I had stopped asking the hard questions because I didn't want the hard answers. I had mistaken the absence of conflict for the presence of connection, and I had let years go by operating on the assumption that because nothing was visibly broken, everything was fine. That assumption cost me 11 years and a house and a version of the future I had planned on. What I track now is different. Not behavior locks, not receipts, not the gap between what someone says and what the evidence shows. I pay attention to the quality of what's actually in front of me.
Whether I'm genuinely present or just physically there. Whether the people I care about feel that I see them. Not because someone once told a man named Reed that I didn't, but because I decided that version of me was worth leaving behind. I'm not interested in being the protagonist of a betrayal story for the rest of my life. That ending is too small. What I know now is that you can do everything quietly, carefully, and with complete dignity, and still lose something that mattered. That's not a failure of strategy. That's just the cost of trusting someone fully. The lesson isn't to stop trusting. The lesson is to stay awake inside your own life, to notice, to ask, to be present enough that the people you love never have to go looking elsewhere for the feeling of being seen. I learned that too late for my marriage. I don't intend to learn it twice.